The royal nursery sounded like something trapped between a battlefield and a cage. A crash thundered through the stone corridor hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling arches. One of the palace servants stumbled backward through the heavy nursery doors with a scream caught halfway inside her throat. Blood ran down her forearm where sharp claws had torn through fabric and skin alike. Another servant grabbed her before she collapsed completely. No one rushed toward the room she had escaped from. No one ever did anymore. The guards stationed outside the nursery kept their distance with rigid expressions, though the tension in their shoulders betrayed them. Even trained wolves standing beside the royal guards lowered their ears uneasily toward the violent sounds still echoing inside. A deep animal growl vibrated through the chamber walls. Then came silence. The silence frightened people more than the growling. Because silence usually meant the alpha cubs were hunting. Rain battered the towering windows overlooking the eastern courtyard while whispers spread nervously through the palace corridor. She lasted longer than the last one. 3 hours. Still not enough. I heard the younger cub nearly bit through her hand. No, it was the older one this time. A servant crossed herself quickly under her breath. Those children are cursed. Nobody corrected her. The kingdom of Velmora feared many things. Enemy kingdoms. Famine. Winter plagues. Rebellion among lower clans. But within the royal fortress itself, nothing inspired more quiet terror than the twin heirs of the Alpha King. The children had become living rumors before they had even learned to read. Violent. Untouchable. Wild. Some blamed unstable bloodlines. Others whispered that the boys inherited the same brutal instincts that made their father feared across the continent. The older servants spoke of shattered furniture, bitten guards, and nursery maids fleeing in tears before sunrise. Every caretaker eventually broke. The smart ones quit quickly. The unlucky ones stayed longer. At the far end of the corridor stood the newest sacrifice. A quiet Omega woman wrapped in a worn grey cloak dampened by rainwater. Her hands rested calmly in front of her despite the screaming still echoing from behind the nursery doors. She did not look terrified enough for the palace steward's liking. The old man adjusted the silver chains hanging from his dark robes before narrowing his eyes toward her. "You heard what happened to the others?" The Omega nodded once. No hesitation. No visible fear. The steward clicked his tongue irritably. Most people begged to leave before reaching this corridor. This woman barely reacted at all. "What is your name again?" "Lyra." Simple answer. Quiet voice. The steward barely remembered seeing her application among the desperate workers brought from the lower districts. She had no noble blood, no palace connections, no recommendations from respected families. Which made her perfect. Disposable people were useful inside royal walls. "If the cubs attack," the steward muttered coldly, "do not challenge them." Another crash sounded inside the chamber. Lyra's eyes flicked briefly toward the doors. The steward continued speaking. "You will avoid direct eye contact during aggressive episodes. You will remain submissive at all times. If they become unstable, lower yourself immediately and wait for the guards." His expression darkened slightly. "Assuming the guards decide to enter." A bitter joke. No one laughed. The Omega simply nodded again. The steward studied her carefully now. Something about her felt strange. Not dangerous exactly. Just difficult to read. Most Omegas carried themselves with visible caution around Alphas. Years of hierarchy forced that behavior naturally into posture and expression. But this woman stood with stillness that felt older than fear itself. Exhausted. Like someone who had already survived the worst thing life intended to give her. The nursery doors shook violently again. A low snarl followed. The steward took a careful step backward before unlocking the heavy iron chain sealing the entrance. "Your shift ends at sunset," he muttered. Then, after brief hesitation, "if you survive until then." The doors creaked open. Warm air rushed outward carrying scent strong enough to make several nearby servants immediately lower their heads. Alpha instinct. Dominant. Aggressive. Unstable. Lyra stepped inside. The doors slammed shut behind her. Heavy locks clicked immediately from the outside. The sound echoed through the enormous chamber like a prison sealing itself. For several seconds she remained still. The royal nursery looked less like a room for children and more like a miniature fortress designed to survive war. Massive stone pillars supported high ceilings painted with ancient wolf sigils. Torn cushions littered the floor beside overturned chairs and shattered wooden toys. Deep claw marks scarred the walls everywhere. Evidence. Not rumors. Reality. Near the far side of the chamber stood the twin heirs. Watching her. The older cub crouched atop a broken table near the windows like a wolf perched on cliff rocks. Golden eyes reflected stormlight pouring through the glass behind him. The younger twin stood near the fireplace gripping a carved wooden wolf so tightly cracks splintered through the toy beneath his fingers. Neither child spoke. Neither moved. But the tension inside the room thickened instantly. Lyra felt their instincts pressing against her the way violent storms pressed against forests before lightning struck. The younger twin inhaled sharply, scenting her. His expression changed immediately. Confusion flickered across his face first. Then suspicion. Then aggression. A low growl vibrated inside his chest. The older twin slowly climbed down from the broken table without taking his eyes off her once. Together they began circling. Predators testing unfamiliar prey. Lyra remained motionless. Her pulse quickened despite years spent mastering emotional control. Every survival instinct inside her screamed the same warning. Lower your gaze. Submit. Do not challenge alpha blood. Yet something about the boys unsettled her differently than ordinary alphas. The aggression felt wrong. Not cruel. Wounded. Lonely. As if the children had spent too long trapped inside fear they could not understand. The younger twin moved first. Fast. Far too fast for a child. He lunged directly toward her with a violent snarl that echoed across the nursery walls. Outside the chamber, servants gasped in horror. Lyra reacted instinctively. A growl ripped from her throat before conscious thought could stop it. Low. Sharp. Dominant. Ancient. The sound froze the world. Both cubs stopped instantly. The younger twin halted so abruptly his bare feet slid across polished stone. Shock widened his eyes. The older twin stiffened completely beside the fireplace. Even the storm outside seemed quieter suddenly. Lyra herself looked stunned. The growl had not felt forced. It had risen naturally from somewhere buried deep beneath memory. Something powerful. Something forgotten. Outside the nursery, absolute silence spread through the corridor. Then footsteps approached. Heavy. Controlled. Dangerous. Every guard immediately straightened. The Alpha King had arrived. King Kael entered without hurry, yet the entire atmosphere shifted around him instantly. Power followed him like winter itself, cold enough to silence every whisper nearby. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Emotion carved from stone. The ruler of Velmora rarely needed to raise his voice because fear moved ahead of him naturally. His dark eyes swept first toward the cubs. Alive. Calm. Uninjured. Then his attention settled on Lyra. And something inside him stopped breathing. Not because of her appearance. Not even because of her scent. Because of the sound she had made. Memory struck him violently. Snow falling beneath moonlight. Silver eyes flashing with fierce defiance. A woman standing before him years ago with blood-staining white winter ground around her feet. Another impossible growl whispered against his throat before darkness swallowed everything. Dead. She had died. Kael knew she had died. Yet the Omega standing before him had produced the exact same instinctive sound. Impossible. The younger twin slowly stepped toward Lyra. Then the older one followed. Kael's guards tensed immediately expecting attack. Instead, both boys pressed themselves silently against the Omega's sides. Protective. Claiming. Kael's expression changed for the first time in years. Shock. Because his sons had never willingly touched another person before. Not servants. Not guards. Not even him. The older twin looked directly at the Alpha King and released a warning growl. At his own father. Several guards inhaled sharply. Kael stared at the Omega woman while old memories clawed violently through his chest. Impossible memories. Impossible instincts. Impossible recognition. For one terrifying moment he felt something he had not experienced since war consumed his youth. Fear. Lyra lowered her eyes carefully under the weight of his attention, though confusion still churned inside her own chest. Why had that growl felt familiar? Why did the king look at her as though he had seen a ghost? And why did the cubs suddenly feel safer standing beside her than anyone else in the palace? The storm outside deepened while silence stretched painfully through the nursery. Finally Kael spoke. "What is your name?" His voice was low enough to vibrate through stone. "Lyra, your majesty." The cub beside her immediately tightened his grip on her sleeve when Kael stepped closer. Another warning growl echoed softly from the child's throat. Kael stopped walking. That unsettled everyone present even more. The Alpha King did not stop for anyone. Yet here he stood motionless because his own heirs refused to let him near an Omega caretaker. Kael studied the boys carefully. Their body language was unmistakable. Trust. Instinctive attachment. Recognition. Impossible. "How long has she been here?" he asked quietly. The steward swallowed hard. "Less than an hour, your majesty." An hour. And already his sons treated her differently than every caretaker before her. Kael's gaze returned slowly toward Lyra. She looked exhausted more than frightened. Shadows rested beneath her eyes like permanent bruises left by sleepless years. Her clothing was simple. Worn. The scent beneath rainwater and smoke carried traces of survival rather than luxury. Nothing about her explained this. Yet his instincts refused to settle. The younger cub suddenly pressed his forehead against Lyra's arm. The gesture was small. Childlike. Trusting. Kael felt something painful twist through his chest. His sons had not acted like children in years. Not since. No. He forced the thought away instantly. The past remained buried for a reason. Kael turned sharply toward the steward. "She remains." Shock flickered across several faces. "Your Majesty," the steward asked carefully. "You heard me." No one argued further. The Alpha King gave one last unreadable look toward Lyra before leaving the nursery without another word. The doors closed behind him heavily. But the tension he left behind lingered long afterward. The cubs stayed beside Lyra even after the king disappeared. Watching her carefully now. Curiously. Like wolves recognizing something long lost to them. Outside the chamber, whispers exploded through palace corridors before sunset arrived. The Omega survived. The cubs obeyed her. And the Alpha King himself had frozen when she growled. By nightfall servants across the fortress repeated the same question endlessly beneath frightened voices. Who was she? Rain continued falling long after darkness swallowed Velmora completely. The fortress itself towered above black cliffs like something carved from shadow and iron. Torches flickered along massive stone walls while wolves patrolled outer courtyards restlessly beneath the storm. Inside the royal nursery, however, an unfamiliar quiet settled over the room. Not peace exactly, but less chaos. Lyra knelt beside the fireplace, slowly repairing one of the wooden toys broken earlier that morning. The twins watched her carefully from nearby cushions. Still wary. Still dangerous. But calmer. Every few moments one of them would glance toward her as if confirming she remained there. The behavior unsettled her more than aggression. Attachment was dangerous. She had learned that lesson years ago. The younger cub finally spoke first. "Why did you growl at us?" His voice sounded rough from disuse. Lyra paused. Because honestly, she did not know. "It happened by accident," she answered softly. The older twin narrowed his eyes immediately. "No." The certainty in his tone surprised her. That wasn't fear. Lyra looked away toward the fire. No. It had not been fear. That frightened her too. She changed the subject quietly. "You should eat before sleeping." Neither child moved toward the untouched food trays. Instead the younger twin asked, "Why aren't you scared?" A strange question. Lyra considered it carefully. Because she was scared. Terrified, actually. But fear became different after surviving enough pain. Eventually exhaustion hollowed emotions until survival simply became routine. "I have been afraid for a very long time," she admitted finally. The boys stared at her silently. Then something unexpected happened. The older twin walked across the room and sat beside her near the fireplace. Close. Not touching, but close enough to matter. Lyra's breath caught slightly. The servants had been right about one thing. These children did not trust anyone. Yet here they sat beside her willingly after knowing her only hours. The younger twin eventually joined them too. None spoke afterward. The fire crackled softly while rain struck high windows beyond the nursery walls. For the first time in years, the chamber felt less like a cage holding monsters and more like a room holding lonely children. Far above them, however, King Kael stood alone inside his private chambers, unable to silence the war inside his mind. Moonlight spilled across dark stone while untouched reports covered the massive desk before him. Normally he worked late into every night reviewing military movements, trade disputes, border conflicts. Tonight he remembered silver eyes instead. And a growl that should not exist anymore. Kael poured another glass of whiskey without tasting it. His advisor's earlier words echoed faintly inside his thoughts. You are distracted. He tightened his jaw. No. He was cautious. Nothing more. Yet the memory refused to release him. Years earlier there had been another Omega. Not weak. Not submissive. Wild enough to challenge him without fear. She had laughed at royal rules. Mocked noble traditions. Growled against his throat during arguments like she had been born without understanding hierarchy itself. And then she died. Or at least, that was what he had been told. Kael closed his eyes briefly. He still remembered the blood on snow. Still remembered arriving too late. Still remembered burying rage so deeply inside himself that afterward he transformed into the cold King Velmora feared today. The kingdom believed grief hardened him. In truth, grief hollowed him instead. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter. One of his intelligence guards stepped inside before kneeling immediately. We investigated the Omega caretaker as requested. Kael's gaze sharpened instantly. And? The guard hesitated. That is the problem, Your Majesty. There is almost nothing. Kael frowned. No family records. No official birth registration. No clan ties. She appears suddenly in lower district work records 3 years ago under the name Lyra. Before that. Nothing. Impossible. Everyone left traces somewhere. Unless those traces had been erased deliberately. Kael's expression darkened. Continue searching. Yes, Your Majesty. The guard disappeared quickly. Kael remained motionless beside the window afterward. No past. No history. And instincts that should belong to a dead woman. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains while unease settled deeper inside the Alpha King's chest than any battlefield had ever managed. Something inside his kingdom was waking. And for the first time in years, he no longer controlled it. Morning arrived beneath grey skies and cold wind sweeping across palace towers. Servants entered the nursery expecting destruction. Instead they found both alpha cubs asleep beside the Omega caretaker near the fireplace. No shattered furniture. No blood. No screaming. The entire room fell silent. One servant nearly dropped the breakfast trays from shock. The younger twin stirred first, immediately looking toward Lyra before relaxing again once he saw her nearby. Safe. The expression in his eyes made several servants visibly uneasy. The palace had spent years fearing these children. Now the children looked at an Omega like frightened wolves finally finding shelter. Word spread faster than wildfire. By midday nearly every servant in Velmora knew the same terrifying truth. The Alpha heirs had accepted her. And nothing inside the royal fortress would remain the same after that. The palace changed quietly after the Omega caretaker survived her first night. Not openly. Not in ways anyone could formally report to the Alpha King. But fear moved differently through Velmora now. Servants who once crossed corridors confidently began lowering their voices whenever Lyra passed nearby. Guards stationed outside the royal nursery no longer looked bored during their shifts. Noble women visiting the eastern halls suddenly found excuses to linger near open doorways just long enough to glimpse the mysterious Omega inside. The entire fortress had become aware of her existence. And inside royal walls, attention was rarely a gift. It was usually the beginning of danger. By sunrise on the second morning, rumors had already twisted beyond recognition. She subdued the heirs with dominance. No Omega can do that naturally. I heard the cubs bowed to her. They say the king himself looked frightened. That last whisper spread fastest. Because the idea itself felt impossible. King Kael inspired fear in others. He did not experience it himself. Yet several guards swore they had seen the Alpha King freeze the moment Lyra growled inside the nursery. Most people dismissed the story as exaggeration. A few did not. Those few became dangerous immediately. Inside the nursery, however, none of those whispers mattered. The room felt strangely calm compared to the rest of the palace. Warm firelight flickered across stone walls while morning rain tapped softly against high windows. The younger twin sat cross-legged near the fireplace pulling apart pieces of bread while the older cub watched Lyra from across the room with unsettling focus. Neither child had tried attacking a servant since her arrival. That alone had begun terrifying the staff more than violence ever did. Lyra moved quietly through the chamber gathering scattered blankets from the floor. Her body still felt tense beneath her calm expression. Sleep had barely touched her the previous night. Every time she closed her eyes, broken fragments of memory clawed through darkness inside her mind. Snow. Silver eyes. Blood spreading across white ground. A voice calling desperately through a storm. Then pain. Endless pain. She had awakened before dawn, shaking hard enough to frighten herself. The memories never fully formed. Only sensations remained. But something inside her instincts had begun waking since entering the palace. And she feared what would happen if it woke completely. The younger cub suddenly looked up from the fireplace. You didn't leave. Lyra blinked softly. What? Everyone leaves. The simple statement struck harder than accusations would have. The older twin looked away immediately toward the windows as though ashamed his brother spoke aloud what neither child usually admitted. Loneliness. It lived everywhere inside this room. Inside the claw marks. Inside the shattered furniture. Inside the aggression everyone feared. Lyra lowered herself carefully beside the younger cub. I said I would stay. The boy studied her quietly. Why? Because she had nowhere else to go. Because something inside her chest hurt whenever she looked at them. Because for the first time in years, someone looked relieved simply by her presence. But Lyra did not know how to explain any of that. So instead she answered softly, because someone should. The younger twin stared at her for several long seconds before lowering his gaze again. That tiny reaction carried more trust than words. And somehow that frightened Lyra more than the growling had. Across the palace, King Kael had not slept at all. The storm outside finally faded near dawn, but the storm inside him only worsened with every passing hour. He stood beside the massive windows of his private chambers watching grey clouds drift over Velmora's cliffs while untouched reports remained scattered across his desk behind him. Trade disputes. Military movement. Border tensions. Normally he handled each issue without hesitation. Today he remembered an Omega growling instead. His jaw tightened. Ridiculous. One sound should not have unsettled him this deeply. Yet the memory would not release him. Kael closed his eyes briefly and immediately saw another winter night years earlier. Snow falling heavily through pine forests. Silver eyes glaring up at him with stubborn fury. A woman laughing breathlessly after pinning him against a tree despite his rank, despite his strength, despite every royal law meant to keep Omegas obedient. You growl too much, she had whispered once against his throat. And you don't enough. Kael's chest tightened violently. Dead. She was dead. He had spent years forcing himself to accept that truth. Then Lyra entered his palace carrying instincts that should have vanished with the grave. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter. The doors opened carefully. Lord Varin stepped inside. Tall. Sharp-faced. Dressed in silver-trimmed royal black. Kael trusted few men completely, but Varin had served beside him since war consumed their youth. Which meant he noticed things others missed. You are avoiding counsel again, Varin said carefully. Kael did not turn from the windows. I attended yesterday. You sat silent while nobles nearly argued themselves into bloodshed. That sounds productive. Varin sighed softly. Then his expression sharpened. This concerns the Omega. Kael's silence answered enough. The palace is talking, Varin continued quietly. More than usual. Let them. You know I cannot. Kael finally turned. Cold authority settled instantly back across his features like armor. What exactly are you suggesting? Varin hesitated. That your reaction frightened people. Kael's expression darkened dangerously. But Varin continued anyway. You looked at that Omega woman like you recognized her. Silence filled the chamber. Heavy. Dangerous. Finally Kael spoke. She reminds me of someone. Not a lie. But nowhere near the full truth either. Varin studied him carefully. The dead Omega. Kael's jaw locked immediately. Even after all these years, few dared mention her aloud inside palace walls. Varin lowered his voice further. I thought you buried that past. So did I. The answer came colder than intended. Varin moved slowly closer toward the desk. What if this is coincidence? Kael wanted to believe that. Truly. But instincts older than logic refused to settle. Coincidence did not explain his son's behavior. It did not explain the growl. And it certainly did not explain why the cubs looked calmer beside Lyra than they ever had beside him. That realization wounded more deeply than he cared admitting. They trust her, Varin observed quietly. Kael looked away toward the storm clouds again. Yes. You sound angry about it. Kael answered without hesitation. I am. But the anger was not directed toward Lyra. It aimed inward. Toward himself. Because no matter how fiercely he protected his heirs, his son still looked at him with caution instead of comfort. And after only one night, they already looked at the Omega like safety itself. The realization hollowed something inside his chest. Meanwhile, beneath the eastern tower, Lyra's second day inside the nursery became increasingly strange. The cubs followed her everywhere now. Not constantly beside her, but always nearby enough to watch. When she crossed the room, they tracked her movement automatically. When servants entered carrying food or supplies, both boys instinctively positioned themselves between strangers and Lyra without seeming aware they were doing it. The servants noticed. And feared it. One maid dropped an entire tray after the older twin released a warning growl merely because she stepped too quickly toward Lyra's shoulder. The girl fled immediately afterward, nearly in tears. Lyra exhaled heavily once the doors shut again. You cannot threaten everyone who walks near me. The younger cub frowned slightly. Why not? Because they are trying to help. No, the older twin muttered quietly from beside the windows. They're scared. The room fell silent. Because he was right. Everyone inside the palace feared them. Even now. Especially now. Lyra looked toward the boys carefully. Does that bother you? The younger twin shrugged. But the older one answered after long hesitation. They always smell afraid. The statement carried no arrogance. Only exhaustion. Like children too used to being treated as monsters. Something painful twisted through Lyra's chest again. She understood isolation too well. For several moments nobody spoke. Then suddenly, a violent headache slammed into Lyra hard enough to steal her breath. Her vision blurred instantly. Fragments exploded across her mind. A royal crest burning in firelight. Someone screaming her name. Hands covered in blood. Then, a child crying. Not one child. Two. Twin cries echoing through darkness. Lyra staggered sharply backward, gripping the nearest pillar for balance. The cubs moved instantly. Both boys reached her before she fully collapsed. The younger twin grabbed her wrist while the older cub positioned himself protectively in front of her with a low warning growl aimed toward the doors. As though danger had entered the room. Lyra forced herself to breathe slowly. The visions vanished again almost immediately. But terror remained. Twin cries. Why had she recognized those cries? Are you hurt? The younger cub asked quietly. Lyra looked at them both. Fear crawled slowly beneath her skin now. Not because of the visions. Because the boy's panic felt instinctive. Personal. As though seeing her in pain frightened them deeply. "I'm fine," she whispered. The older twin clearly did not believe her. Neither did she. That evening the royal court gathered for dinner beneath massive chandeliers glittering above the grand hall. Nobles filled long black tables whispering carefully beneath candlelight while musicians played soft melodies near the far walls. Yet beneath the elegant atmosphere, tension simmered openly tonight. Because every conversation eventually circled back toward the Omega caretaker. She cannot remain near the heirs. She influences them too strongly already. The cubs attacked servants for years. Now suddenly they obey. Something is wrong. Queen mothers from lesser clans exchanged worried glances while powerful alphas muttered quietly behind silver goblets. At the center of it all sat King Kael. Silent. Unreadable. Dangerous. Which only made the nobles more nervous. Finally Lord Edric cleared his throat carefully. "Your Majesty." Kael's gaze lifted slowly. The older noble hesitated briefly beneath those cold eyes before continuing. Perhaps the Omega should be reassigned. Silence spread instantly across nearby tables. Kael set his glass down calmly. "Why?" Edric swallowed once. "The heirs have grown, unusually attached." And several nobles shifted uncomfortably. An Omega influencing royal alpha heirs violated centuries of hierarchy. Everyone understood that even if nobody wished saying it directly. Lord Edric finally forced the words out. "It appears improper." Kael leaned back slightly in his chair. "Improper." The single repeated word carried enough coldness to silence half the hall immediately. Edric hurried onward. "The kingdom watches everything involving your sons carefully. Rumors are spreading already." Kael's expression never changed. "What rumors?" No one answered. Because speaking palace rumors aloud inside the Alpha King's presence felt dangerously close to suicide. Kael's voice lowered further. "I asked a question." Finally Lady Sorrel answered carefully from farther down the table. "Some believe the Omega manipulates the heirs." Kael stared at her. Then something unexpected happened. He laughed once. Soft. Humorless. The sound unsettled the entire room more than shouting would have. "My sons nearly tore apart trained guards," Kael said quietly. "Yet now an exhausted Omega woman survives beside them peacefully and your greatest concern is manipulation." No one responded. Because beneath the king's coldness lingered something worse tonight. Emotion. Unstable emotion. Kael rose slowly from his chair. Instant silence followed. "If any noble inside this hall believes they can manage the heirs more effectively," he said calmly, "I will gladly escort them to the nursery personally." Nobody volunteered. Kael left without another word. The musicians stopped playing only after the doors slammed shut behind him. Far above the dining hall, moonlight covered Velmora in silver silence. Kael walked the palace corridors alone until his footsteps eventually carried him toward the eastern nursery tower once again. He told himself it was strategy, observation, protection, not obsession. Yet deep down even he no longer believed that lie. The nursery doors stood slightly open tonight. Firelight flickered softly through the crack. Kael approached silently, then stopped. Inside, Lyra sat beside the fireplace while the twins slept against her shoulders beneath thick blankets. One cub pressed against each side of her protectively even in sleep. And Lyra. Lyra gently stroked the younger twin's hair with slow absent movements that made Kael's chest ache unexpectedly. The scene looked painfully familiar. Not because of the woman he lost years ago. Because of the life he almost had once. Warmth. Peace. Family untouched by politics and blood. Gone. Destroyed long ago. Kael should have left immediately. Instead he remained standing there watching quietly while old grief reopened inside him piece by piece. Then Lyra spoke softly without looking toward the door. "You keep watching us." Kael stiffened slightly. "You noticed." "I noticed the first night." Silence settled again. Finally Kael entered slowly. The cubs remained asleep. That alone shocked him. Normally the boys awakened instantly whenever another alpha approached. But beside Lyra their instincts rested peacefully. Kael stopped several feet away. For the first time since her arrival, they stood alone together without guards or servants nearby. The fire crackled softly between them. Lyra looked exhausted tonight. But there was something else now too. Fear. Not fear of him. Fear of herself. Kael noticed immediately. You're remembering things. Her breath caught. The sharp reaction answered enough. How do you know? She whispered. Because he remembered the exact same expression years ago after another Omega began recovering memories someone desperately wanted buried. Kael forced his voice steady. What do you remember? Lyra looked down toward the sleeping cubs. Nothing clearly. Fragments. Pain. Twin cries echoing through darkness. Blood on snow. A voice screaming her name. Every memory felt close enough to touch yet impossible to fully grasp. Kael studied her carefully, then quietly asked the question haunting him most. Have you ever been to Velmora before? Lyra frowned immediately. No. But the answer lacked certainty. Kael noticed. So did she. Silence deepened painfully between them. Then suddenly the older twin stirred awake beside Lyra. Golden eyes opened sleepily before immediately fixing onto Kael standing nearby. Tension returned instantly. The child moved closer against Lyra's side with a protective growl rumbling softly inside his chest. Kael's expression darkened faintly. Even half asleep, his son still guarded the Omega from him. The older twin whispered something quietly then. So quietly Kael almost missed it. Don't take her. The words hit like a blade. Because beneath aggression and violence, that was what his sons feared most. Abandonment. Loss. Kael looked away sharply. Something inside his carefully controlled composure cracked a little further tonight. And for the first time in many years, the Alpha King realized the most dangerous threat inside Velmora was not war, rebellion, or political enemies. It was truth. And truth was finally beginning to wake. Winter arrived early in Velmora. Cold winds swept through the mountain fortress day and night, rattling ancient windows and carrying storms across the black cliffs surrounding the kingdom. Frost gathered along stone corridors before sunrise while servants hurried through the palace with lowered heads and trembling hands. But the cold outside the fortress felt harmless compared to the tension growing within it. Because the royal heirs were changing. And everyone noticed. The alpha cubs no longer prowled the palace like untamed wolves searching for enemies. Their violent outbursts became rare. The shattered furniture inside the nursery stopped piling up. Servants could enter rooms without immediately bracing for attack. Yet the calmer the cubs became around Lyra, the more frightened the palace grew. Fear was easier to understand when the heirs acted like monsters. This new behavior unsettled people far more. One morning the younger twin walked directly through the eastern corridor beside Lyra carrying books pressed tightly against his chest. Palace servants froze where they stood watching in disbelief. The child was calm. Quiet. Not restrained. Not threatening anyone. Then another servant accidentally brushed too close to Lyra's shoulder while passing them. The older twin appeared instantly. A low warning growl echoed through the corridor before anyone even saw him move. The servant stumbled backward pale with terror. The cub stepped protectively in front of Lyra. Golden eyes narrowed dangerously until the frightened man hurried away. Then just as quickly, the child relaxed again once the Omega continued walking. The entire corridor remained silent long after they disappeared. The rumors spreading through Velmora worsened after that. She controls them. No, they're protecting her. That's even worse. I heard the older cub attacked a guard for speaking against her. The king should remove her before this becomes scandal. Scandal. Such a harmless word for the panic consuming the royal court. Because deep beneath those whispers lurked another fear nobody wished speaking aloud. The heirs trusted an Omega more than their own bloodline. And that threatened the very foundation of Velmora's hierarchy. Inside the nursery, however, Lyra tried desperately to ignore the growing hostility surrounding her. The cubs sat near the fireplace while she repaired one of their torn blankets carefully beneath warm firelight. Snow drifted softly outside the towering windows. The room felt peaceful tonight. Too peaceful. Lyra had lived long enough to distrust peace completely. The younger twin glanced toward her quietly. "You're thinking again." She blinked softly. "What?" "You make that face when you're scared." The observation startled her. No one usually noticed her emotions anymore. Years of survival had taught her how to bury fear beneath silence. Yet somehow these children saw through her anyway. "I'm not scared," she lied gently. The older twin immediately looked up from the floor. "Yes, you are." Lyra sighed softly. Perhaps lying to children who spent their lives studying danger was pointless. She folded the blanket slowly across her lap. "The palace doesn't like me." The younger cub frowned. "We like you." The simple answer tightened something painful inside her chest. Because the boys spoke with complete certainty. No politics. No hidden meaning. Just truth. Lyra looked toward the fire quickly before emotion could fully surface across her face. Attachment was dangerous. Every day she spent with them deepened a bond she did not understand and could not control. And somewhere beneath that growing warmth, fear kept whispering the same warning endlessly. "This cannot last." A sharp knock interrupted the moment. All three froze instantly. The older twin moved first. He stepped directly between Lyra and the nursery doors with a growl already forming inside his throat. The younger cub mirrored him immediately beside the fireplace. Protective. Always protective now. Lyra's pulse tightened. "Enter," she called carefully. The doors opened. Lord Varin stepped inside wearing his usual composed expression, though caution lingered clearly in his posture around the cubs. The boys did not move from their positions. Varin inclined his head respectfully toward Lyra. "The king requests your presence." Tension filled the room immediately. Lyra's fingers tightened around the blanket. "Why?" Varin hesitated. He did not explain. Which meant something serious had happened. The cubs sensed it too. The older twins' growl deepened slightly. Varin remained calm despite the warning. "I assure you no harm will come to her." Neither child looked convinced. Lyra slowly rose to her feet. "It's all right." The younger cub stood quickly beside her. "We're coming too." Varin's expression tightened faintly. "The king requested the Omega alone." "No," the older twin said immediately. The single word carried frightening intensity for a child. Varin studied them carefully now. The attachment had grown even stronger than palace rumors suggested. Interesting. Dangerous. Lyra crouched slowly beside the boys. "I'll return soon." The younger twin shook his head instantly. Fear flickered openly across his face for the first time in weeks. "They always say that." The words hit harder than shouting ever could. Lyra felt her chest ache sharply, because abandonment had become normal for these children long before she arrived. She gently touched the younger cub's cheek. "I will come back." The older twin watched her silently for several long seconds, then finally stepped aside. But only barely. As Lyra followed Varin through the nursery doors, both cubs remained standing motionless behind her, watching every step like wolves guarding something precious. The palace corridors felt colder tonight. Servants lowered their eyes immediately as Lyra passed beside Lord Varin. Whispers followed them through torchlit hallways like shadows crawling across stone. "She's being summoned." Finally. "Do you think the king discovered the truth?" "What truth?" "No one knows." That was the problem. Nobody knew anything anymore. Not even Lyra herself. The deeper she became entangled within Velmora, the more her own memories began slipping strangely beneath the surface of her mind. Broken images returned constantly now. A silver necklace stained with blood. Strong arms carrying her through snow. Pain so intense it stole breath completely. And always. Twin cries. The sound haunted her endlessly. Varin eventually guided her toward the western wing of the fortress where royal archives rested beneath heavy guard. Lyra slowed slightly. Why bring her here? The massive archive doors opened slowly, revealing towering shelves filled with ancient scrolls and royal records stretching high into darkness. King Kael stood alone near the center table waiting. His expression remained unreadable as always. But exhaustion lingered beneath his eyes tonight. Varin bowed slightly before leaving them alone. Silence settled heavily across the archives. Lyra immediately noticed several open records scattered across the table. Family bloodlines, birth registries, royal histories. Kael watched her carefully. Sit. She obeyed cautiously. The Alpha King remained standing. For several moments he said nothing at all. Then finally, your memories are returning faster. Not a question. A statement. Lyra's throat tightened slightly. Yes. Kael looked toward the records spread across the table. Tell me everything you remember. Fear curled slowly through her stomach. Because part of her no longer wanted answers. Answers changed lives. Sometimes they destroyed them. Still, she spoke quietly. Snow. Kael's expression sharpened immediately. A woman screaming. Silence. Blood. Kael's jaw tightened. And babies crying. The room became deathly still. Lyra looked up slowly. For the first time since meeting him, genuine emotion flickered openly across the Alpha King's face. Pain. Not physical pain. Something far older. What aren't you telling me? She whispered. Kael stared at her silently for several seconds. Then he moved toward one of the archive shelves before retrieving an old leather-bound record carefully hidden beneath others. He placed it on the table between them. Lyra looked down. The royal crest of Velmora gleamed faintly across the cover. Kael opened the book slowly. Inside rested a faded portrait sketch. Lyra's breath stopped. The woman in the drawing looked almost identical to her. Silver eyes. Dark hair. The same sharp jawline. The same mouth. The same impossible familiarity. Lyra's hands began trembling immediately. Who is she? Kael answered quietly. Her name was Celine. Was. Not is. Cold spread through Lyra's chest. She died 10 years ago. The room tilted slightly around her. Kael continued watching her carefully. She was accused of betraying the royal bloodline. Lyra could barely breathe now. Why are you showing me this? Because he needed truth. Because his instincts had screamed since the moment she entered the nursery. Because every day beside her made denial harder. Kael lowered his voice. Because you are either connected to her. His gaze locked onto hers fully. Or you are her. The words shattered something inside Lyra's mind instantly. Pain exploded violently behind her eyes. The archives disappeared. Suddenly she stood somewhere else entirely. Snowstorm. Screaming. Hands gripping her shoulders desperately. Kael's voice. Not cold. Terrified. Run. Then agony. Silver fire tearing through darkness. Men attacking through trees. A blade covered in blood. And 2 newborn cries echoing through the night. Lyra gasped sharply as reality crashed back around her. The chair nearly toppled backward beneath her. Kael reached forward instinctively to steady her. The moment his fingers touched her wrist, another memory slammed into both of them. Moonlight. A hidden cabin deep within pine forests. Celine laughing breathlessly while Kael pressed his forehead against hers. You growl like an alpha, he whispered once. And you stare too much, she laughed back. The vision vanished instantly. Both recoiled in shock. Kael's breathing had changed. Lyra stared at him horrified. Those were not random memories. They were shared. Real. No, she whispered shakily. Kael looked equally shaken now. Because he recognized the memory too. Exactly. Perfectly. Silence filled the archives while terror settled between them. Finally Lyra forced herself to speak. Those children. Kael closed his eyes briefly. Yes. Her heart stopped. The cubs. The twin cries haunting her mind. The instinctive connection. The impossible protectiveness. Everything suddenly aligned in horrifying clarity. They're mine. Not a question. A realization. Kael did not deny it. Lyra staggered backward from the table immediately. No. The room felt too small now. Too cold. Too sharp. Someone had erased her life. Someone had stolen years from her memories and buried her beneath another identity entirely. Kael moved slowly toward her. Listen to me. You told me she died. The accusation escaped before Lyra fully realized she spoke aloud. Kael froze. Because beneath confusion and terror, another truth had surfaced inside her instincts. Betrayal. Deep enough to survive memory loss itself. Kael's expression darkened painfully. I believed you did. Lyra stared at him. And somehow the honesty in his voice hurt worst of all. Before either could speak further, the archive doors burst open violently. Lord Varin entered immediately. Urgent. Tense. Your Majesty. Kael turned sharply. What happened? Varin's expression grimaced. The court discovered the sealed bloodline records. Silence. Then, how? We don't know yet. But rumors are spreading through the palace already. Kael's eyes hardened instantly. Dangerous. Varin continued carefully. Several nobles are demanding the Omega's removal immediately. Lyra felt cold dread settle through her chest. The truth was escaping. And once truth spread through Velmora, blood always followed. Kael's voice lowered dangerously. Who knows? Too many. The atmosphere inside the archives shifted instantly from shock to threat. Lyra understood suddenly. The palace would never allow this peacefully. An Omega connected to the royal bloodline. No, not connected. The mother of the heirs themselves. Chaos would consume the kingdom. Kael looked toward her sharply. You cannot return openly to the nursery tonight. Lyra stared at him in disbelief. The cubs will be protected. No one protects them emotionally except me. The answer came fiercer than intended. Kael fell silent. Because she was right. The realization hurt both of them equally. Varin interrupted carefully. Your Majesty, the council is already gathering. Kael's expression darkened further. Of course they were. The nobles smelled weakness now. Scandal. Instability. Opportunity. Lyra stepped backward slowly. Fear churned violently inside her chest. Not for herself. For the twins. If the court viewed her as threat, they would use the children against her immediately. Kael noticed the panic forming across her expression. Listen carefully. His voice lowered. No matter what happens tonight, you do not leave the Eastern Tower. Lyra looked at him sharply. You think they'll try something? Kael did not answer directly. Which answered enough. Meanwhile inside the nursery, the cubs already sensed something wrong. The younger twin paced restlessly near the fireplace while the older cub stood beside the windows staring toward distant palace lights. She's late, the younger whispered. The older twin remained silent. But tension radiated through him violently now. Then suddenly, pain slammed through both boys at once. Not physical pain. Instinct. Bond. Fear not belonging to them. The younger cub gasped sharply, clutching his chest. The older twin's eyes widened instantly. She's scared. Neither child hesitated. The nursery doors exploded open moments later as both cubs sprinted directly into the palace corridors before guards could react. Servants shouted in alarm. But the boys kept running. Because somewhere inside the fortress, the Omega they trusted above everyone else was afraid. And instinct demanded they reach her immediately. Far below in the royal council chamber, nobles were already descending toward chaos. She deceived the crown. The heirs cannot remain near her. If the kingdom learns the truth, they will learn the truth, another noble snapped. Half the palace already whispers about it. Kael entered the chamber like a storm breaking open. Silence crashed instantly across the room. The Alpha King's expression alone warned everyone present that tonight balanced dangerously close to violence. Lord Edric rose carefully. Your Majesty, we must discuss the Omega. No, Kael answered coldly. You will listen. Tension tightened immediately. Kael stepped toward the center of the chamber slowly. No one touches her. Several nobles exchanged alarmed glances. Lady Sorrel spoke carefully. Your Majesty, if the rumors are true, They are. The confession detonated across the chamber. Shock spread everywhere. Some nobles went pale instantly. Others looked triumphant. Because scandal had finally become certainty. Kael's voice lowered further. She remains under royal protection. Impossible. Edric snapped suddenly. An Omega connected to the heirs threatens every alliance within Velmora. No, Kael growled quietly. His eyes turned lethal. What threatens Velmora is the council believing they may decide who deserves protection inside my kingdom. Fear spread immediately again. But Lord Edric pressed forward desperately. The people will see weakness. Kael moved faster than anyone expected. 1 second he stood across the chamber. The next his hand gripped Edric's throat hard enough to silence the noble instantly. Complete terror froze the room. Kael's voice became deadly calm. Then let them. No one moved. No one breathed. Because for the first time in years, the Alpha King no longer sounded emotionally detached. He sounded personal. Protective. And that terrified the royal court far more than his usual coldness ever had. Then suddenly the council chamber doors burst open. The twin heirs stood there breathing hard from running through half the palace. Their golden eyes searched the room instantly. Then locked onto Kael. Where is she? The younger cub demanded. Silence deepened. Kael slowly released Edric. The older twin stepped forward next. Low growls already vibrating inside his chest. The nobles recoiled instinctively. Not because the cubs looked violent tonight. Because they looked afraid. And frightened alpha heirs were unpredictable creatures. Kael stared at his sons carefully. How much had they sensed through instinct alone? Enough. Clearly enough. The younger twin looked around the chamber wildly. You made her cry. The accusation struck harder than any blade. Kael's chest tightened painfully. Because somewhere inside the fortress, Lyra truly was crying now. Alone. Terrified. After spending years without memories only to discover her entire life had been stolen. The older twin suddenly stepped protectively in front of his brother. A direct challenge toward the royal court itself. And for the first time in Velmora's history, the future heirs of the Alpha Kingdom openly chose an Omega over their own throne. Snow buried Velmora beneath white silence by morning. But inside the fortress, the kingdom was already tearing itself apart. Whispers moved faster than winter wind through every corridor, servant hall, and royal chamber. Guards avoided eye contact during patrols. Nobles locked themselves inside private rooms speaking in hushed panic behind sealed doors. The truth had escaped. The Omega caretaker was not a servant. She was connected to the royal bloodline. And the Alpha heirs had chosen her publicly before the entire council. That single moment shattered years of carefully controlled power. Inside the Eastern Tower, Lyra sat motionless beside the nursery fireplace while the twins slept against her sides. Neither cub wanted to release her for even a moment now. Fear clung to them openly. Every time footsteps echoed beyond the nursery doors, both boys tensed instantly like wolves expecting hunters. Lyra understood the feeling too well. Her memories had returned in broken waves throughout the night. Not completely. Never completely. But enough. Enough to destroy the fragile identity she built over the past decade. Celine. That name echoed endlessly inside her thoughts now. Her real name. Not Lyra. Not the quiet Omega who survived in lower districts by hiding from the world. Celine. The woman who once stood beside the Alpha King beneath moonlight and believed love could survive inside a brutal kingdom. A bitter ache tightened through her chest. How naive she had been. Another memory surfaced violently. Snowstorm. Pain tearing through her body after childbirth. Kael screaming her name somewhere beyond the trees. Then soldiers. Not enemies. Royal guards. Their blades stained with blood while someone shouted, "The heirs must survive." The memory shattered apart before she saw more. Celine pressed trembling fingers against her temples. Someone inside Velmora had betrayed her. Someone powerful enough to erase her existence completely. The nursery doors opened softly. Kael entered alone. The cubs woke instantly. The older twin moved protectively in front of Selene before fully opening his eyes. The reaction struck Kael visibly, though he hid it quickly. His sons no longer saw him as safety. Only her. Selene looked up slowly. The distance between them felt unbearable now. Not strangers. Not allies. Something far more painful. People connected by love, blood, grief, and betrayal. Kael dismissed the guards outside with a glance before stepping farther into the room. The council demands your removal from the palace. Selene laughed once softly. Broken. Only removal. Kael's expression darkened. They fear what you represent. I don't even know what I represent anymore. Silence settled heavily. The younger twin slowly gripped Selene's sleeve tighter, as though afraid she might disappear if he loosened his hold. Kael noticed. Pain flickered briefly across his face again. Years. He had spent years trying to protect his sons through strength and discipline. Yet the one thing they truly needed had been stolen before they could remember it. Her. Selene finally forced herself to speak. You believed I died. Kael's jaw tightened immediately. I buried an empty coffin. The confession stunned her. Kael looked toward the fire rather than her. They told me your body was destroyed during the attack. Another memory slammed into Selene instantly. A wagon. Darkness. Hands forcing liquid down her throat while voices whispered around her. Erase everything. She remembers too much. Her breathing quickened sharply. Kael noticed immediately. What did you see? Selene looked at him with growing horror. Someone wanted me forgotten. Not killed. Forgotten. Because death created martyrs. Erasure created silence. Kael's eyes hardened dangerously. Only a handful of people possessed enough authority to manipulate royal memory records and conceal the mother of the heirs completely, which meant the betrayal came from inside the crown itself. The realization filled the room with cold fury. Before either could speak further, pounding footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. Lord Varin entered moments later looking grim. Your Majesty. Kael turned sharply. What now? The Southern Court opened the sealed bloodline archives publicly. Silence. Varin continued carefully. The kingdom knows. Everything stopped. Selene felt the room tilt beneath her. No more rumors. No more whispers. The truth now belonged to Velmora itself. And kingdoms destroyed people far faster than secrets ever could. Kael's expression became terrifyingly calm. Who authorized it? Varin hesitated. Queen Mother Isolde. The name struck like poison. Selene's memories exploded instantly. Cold silver eyes watching from palace shadows years ago. A voice whispering beside her ear. You were never meant to stand beside a king. The Queen Mother. Kael's mother. Understanding crashed through Selene all at once. Isolde had never accepted an Omega carrying royal heirs. Never accepted her closeness to Kael. Never accepted the possibility of weaker blood influencing the throne. The betrayal had begun long before the attack. Kael realized it seconds later. Shock twisted slowly into rage. No. Varin lowered his gaze carefully. There's more. Kael looked ready to kill someone already. Yet Varin forced the final truth out anyway. The Queen Mother claims the Omega manipulated the crown 10 years ago, and returned now to reclaim power through the heirs. The nursery erupted instantly. The older twin snarled violently enough to shake the room while the younger cub clung to Selene in panic. Kael moved before thinking. His alpha instinct exploded through the chamber like wildfire. Windows rattled. The fire roared higher. Even Varin stepped backward under the sheer force of his fury. For years Kael ruled through controlled coldness. But now control was collapsing completely. They touched her, he growled softly. The room itself seemed afraid of him. Selene stared at Kael silently. Not because of his anger. Because beneath it she saw something else clearly now. Guilt. He blamed himself. For believing the lies. For failing to protect her. For allowing their sons to grow up without the one person they instinctively searched for their entire lives. The weight of it was destroying him. Kael turned toward Selene suddenly. You're leaving the fortress tonight. Shock crossed her face instantly. What? The council will move against you before sunrise. I won't abandon them again. You think I'm asking? The sharpness in his voice startled even himself. Silence followed immediately afterward. Then Kael closed his eyes briefly. Exhaustion finally breaking through. When they realize the heirs choose you over the throne, they will use the boys against you. Fear stabbed through Celine's chest. Because she knew he was right. The cubs were no longer political symbols. They were leverage. Weapons. Targets. The younger twin looked between them anxiously. We're coming too. No, Kael answered instantly. Both boys growled at once. The sound echoed through the nursery with frightening intensity. Celine's chest ached painfully. They were children. Only children. Yet the kingdom forced them to stand inside political warfare before they even understood what betrayal truly meant. The older twin stepped protectively in front of Celine again. We stay with her. Kael stared at his sons silently. Then finally something inside him broke completely. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like ice cracking beneath unbearable weight. He looked at the boys and realized the truth he spent years avoiding. Fear had never made them loyal. Fear had only made them lonely. Celine saw the moment happen in his eyes. The collapse of the man who believed strength meant emotional distance. Kael slowly knelt before his sons for the first time in years. The twins froze immediately. So did Celine. Kael's voice lowered roughly. I know you're afraid. The younger cub looked shocked. Because the Alpha King never acknowledged fear. Not theirs. Not his own. Kael continued quietly. But I will not let anyone take her from you again. Again. The word shattered the remaining distance inside the room. Celine's eyes burned suddenly. Because beneath all the power, violence, and mistakes, Kael had suffered too. Years believing she died. Years raising grieving children who never understood why they felt incomplete. Years surrounded by betrayal. The older twin slowly relaxed first. Then the younger one. Neither moved away from Celine. But for the first time, they stopped looking at Kael like an enemy. A fragile silence settled across the nursery. Then, the fortress bells began ringing violently outside. Everyone froze. Varin moved toward the windows instantly. Smoke rose from the lower city beyond the palace walls. Panic spread through distant streets. The people know, Varin whispered. Chaos had begun. And Velmora would never be the same again.